And we're talking about conditional chains and contrapositives. So I'll start with contrapositives, that being the basis for forming conditional chains. I've got a little worksheet, or really a series of slides that I'll be presenting on. And of course, I'll share the link with you here. So you have a copy to save for later. You don't need to obsessively take notes on every little thing. As they were saying in the previous session, you don't want to write down everything and transcribe it word for word. You want to just process and understand, let it all soak in. And so that's what I want you to do here as well. So those are the slides, and I'm going to pull them up and we'll go through them together. Conditional statements. Start there. So what are conditional statements? Conditional statements are formed from the combination of two sentences expressed if then, very simply. My favorite example of this is, if I eat pizza, then I'll be happy. So you've probably seen them. I'm coming at this specifically from a logic games perspective. And of course, by the way, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. I'm happy to address them at any point. Of course, you can also type them in the chat, but it's better if you unmute yourself just so we can have a little bit of a dialogue around everything. If you're not speaking, please do me a favor and put yourself on mute just so we don't get tons of background noise. So conditional statements, if then, very simple. You've seen them all before, especially common in grouping logic games. Typically you'll see them in the initial rules of the game. And in out games, when you have the same variables featured in multiple rules, that suggests that you'll probably be able to link them together in some way. So if you have A requires B and B requires C, you can naturally form a chain. A requires B requires C. Alternatively, if you had A requires B and you separately had C requires B, you could then form a different sort of connection, saying that A and C each independently lead to B. Also framing it as A or C, then B. So it all depends on what's the necessary, what's the sufficient. We'll get into some examples together. So in that conditional, if I eat pizza, then I'll be happy. I eat pizza is the sufficient. It's the activator, known in formal logic as the antecedent, which you don't really need to know that term, but I'm putting it there for those who like the formal logic stuff. I'm happy is the necessary condition, also known as the consequent in formal logic. Diagramming it simply, P requires H. The sufficient requires the necessary. So it requires it, it activates it. Now, everybody loves indicator words. I've put a bunch of the most common ones for you here. Again, they're in the download. You don't need to write them all down now. Don't worry if you don't catch all of them. But basically, the sufficient condition indicators are all synonymous with sufficiency. Necessary condition indicators are all synonymous with necessity. Common source of confusion is the word only is typically a necessary condition indicator. You see here only, only if, only when. But the only is a sufficient condition indicator. And that's confusing because you see the word only there, but the only changes the meaning entirely. So take special note of that. I'm happy to walk through examples at some point if you like, but just note that for now as a red flag. Now, sufficient condition, again, left of the arrow is enough to cause or activate the necessary condition. So if you have X requires Y, X is the sufficient and Y is the necessary. Necessary is on the right side of the arrow. It often appears after a comma. So if A happens, comma, then B happens. You could put a comma there maybe if you want to. If you're lacking the words if then, the comma becomes even more important in a lot of cases. And again, it's required by the sufficient conditions. You could think that the sufficient is forcing something else to occur. The necessary is what must follow. And there can be chronological aspects to that, although there aren't always. So simple contrapositives, again, you're looking for a conditional statement logically equivalent to the original statement. It could be phrased differently. One might be positive, one might be negative, but they still have the same meaning. So X arrow Y is equivalent to not Y arrow not X. And of course, we'll get into examples on that, but they look completely different. Again, reversing things around the arrow and negating them, but same meaning, equivalent in the end. So it's not really new information, it's just simply a new framing of the old information, but a new framing can often be useful. So how you do it, you reverse the order of the conditions around the arrows and you negate both parts. So if we have the original X requires not Y, you switch them around the arrow, you negate both. Anybody want to unmute themselves or type in the chat what the result would be here if we were to take the contrapositive with this example?
I'll give it a shot. So the contrapositive of this would be if Y, then not X.
Perfect, exactly. Yeah, thanks for that, Alyssa. So Y, arrow, not X. Judy and Ethan and Winnie all typed it in the chat as well. You all got it. Awesome. So steps are, and there's the result Y, arrow, not X. The process is you could reverse first if you want. So switching the order of the variables around the arrow. Then you could negate them. So reversing them, not Y was at the end. Now it's at the beginning. X was at the beginning. Now it's at the end. But we're not done yet because we still have to negate. So negating means that something negative, like not Y, now it becomes positive Y. X was positive, now it's negative. So our result, Y arrow, not X. Again, this is the simple example. It's useful to be able to do it though. It can get more complex, but this is a great starting point. Typically, people will reverse and fail to negate, or they will negate and fail to reverse, neither of which is acceptable, neither of which would give you a result equivalent to the original in meaning. Now with my example, if I eat pizza, then I'll be happy. Reverse the order, negate both parts. So if we have the original as P requires H, what would the contrapositive of that be? Anybody want to share? Again, unmute yourself or just type in the chat. Perfect. So we got some folks in the chat. We got Winnie, we got Ayana saying not H, arrow, not P. Ethan and Alyssa also got it. Perfect. Exactly. So reversing and negating, that's the process. You can negate first, then reverse if you want. Doesn't really matter. Either way it works. So here again, I'm reversing first. P, it was P arrow H. Now we've got H arrow P. We're not done yet. Negate them both. Not H arrow, not P. If I'm not happy, then I didn't eat pizza. That is exactly it. I got a question in the chat from Harry asking, I came across the phrase need not on a practice test. What does that phrase mean conceptually and how would I diagram that? That's an interesting question. So if, let's say X need not require Y. Well, if X needed to require Y, that'd be easy. That'd be simple. X requires Y. But need not means it's not necessarily requiring Y. So there's no conditionality there. X could go along with Y. It could require Y, but it doesn't have to. So if it could require Y, but doesn't have to, it's not really requiring Y, is it? It's simply saying those two things do not have a purely straightforward conditional relationship. Like if you have X contributes to Y or X helps to result in Y, not the same thing as guaranteeing it, not strong enough to be a conditional. That relationship is not going to be simply with an arrow. In fact, they're saying explicitly it need not require Y. So that means that there's no arrow there. You could type, and I'll put this in the chat here, the way I would do a non-conditional, I would say X, Y, X, not arrow, Y. So I'm putting a slash through the arrow itself. X arrow Y, but with the slash meaning X doesn't require Y. Could they be together? Maybe. That's because the slash is through the arrow, not through one of the variables. And we've talked about this in the past when it comes to negating conditional statements. We covered that in a recent mastermind call, the group coaching. And so I have an article on this. I'll pull up at some point and share with everybody. It's about negating conditional statements. I have a video on it inside the course as well. And I'll include those below the recording of this later too. Now, failed contrapositive attempts, back to that. So failed contrapositives is when you only do one part without the other. There are two steps, reversing and negating. If you do both, you're good. If you do only one, you're not good. And the test makers, of course, play on that. They will sometimes include wrong answer choices that are meant there, that are laid there for people who did only one of the two. It's no good. So if you reverse, but you don't negate, it's wrong. If you negate without reversing, it's also wrong. And those are those results give you a situation where you are confusing necessary and sufficient conditions, they're no good. So this is, again, in formal logic terms, reversing without negating is called the converse fallacy. So if you ever look it up, and if you just Google it, you'll find in logic textbooks and such, they talk about the converse. You don't need to know that for the LSAT, that term though. That term is not important, but I'm putting it there for those who want to look it up for more. Converse is you're simply reversing. And if we reverse that example, pizza requires happiness. If you reverse, if you're happy, then you must have eaten pizza. This is problematic, of course, because there are many things that could make me happy. Pizza is simply one of those things. Given the conditional pizza makes me happy, that means that pizza will always make me happy. If I eat pizza, then I'll be happy. If you see me with pizza, then I must be happy. And that's a conditional statement, which is very strong by its nature, because that's saying that even if I eat pizza while I'm getting punched in the face, doesn't matter, I'll still be happy. Even if I eat 10 pizzas, I'll still be happy, which obviously wouldn't be true in real life. There's at some point at which it becomes diminishing marginal returns, and then actually negative, where 2 slices is even better than 1 maybe, but 10 slices, I wish I hadn't had so many. Now the converse, reversing the two, happiness requires pizza. The problem there is that it's failing to consider that there could be other things that also make me happy, that even if I lacked pizza, I could still have something else that made me happy, like tacos, like burritos. Those could also be sufficient to make me happy. Pizza is not the only thing in the world that could do it. Now, I've got a question here I've got a couple questions here, so I'll run through them. Judy was asking about that previous example with the need not. Yeah, if you have a need not situation, you could simply not diagram anything at all. You don't have to. I put that example with the arrow and with a slash through it for those who might want to, but in practice, a non-conditional statement, I think typically is not worth diagramming. Got a question from Alyssa saying, when should you use the contrapositive? Are there certain kinds of problems to apply it to? Yes, there are. The biggest case I would apply it is in grouping logic games with multiple conditional rules. That's going to be the most useful application of this idea. There are also cases where even just a single conditional, it might be useful to do it. So for example, if you have a conditional that was not Y requires not X, well, it's easier to think in positive terms than negative terms. So if we took the contrapositive of that, we end up with X arrow Y, which is a much cleaner result, easier to interpret. There could also be cases where we have multiple conditional rules, but they're not given to us in a neatly joinable fashion. Like I gave earlier the example, A requires B, B requires C. Very straightforward to link those two. But what happens if you have A requires B and then not C requires not B? That becomes a problem because you don't have the same truth value for the part you would want to link, which is the variable B. So I'll type this out just to make it a little bit more clear for those who might have difficulty following when I just speak it and not have anything to look at. So those are my givens. A requires B, not C requires not B. That's not easy to work with. But if we manipulate the second rule to say B requires C, which is the contrapositive of that second rule, then they can be joined much more smoothly. So again, you would want to use this primarily in logic games with multiple conditional rules. There are also some logical reasoning questions that involve formal logic where diagramming multiple conditionals and linking them might be useful, especially in inference questions. We also had a class a few weeks back on sufficient assumption questions, and sufficient assumption questions often lend themselves to formal logic where diagramming could be useful. So look up the lesson on sufficient assumption questions for more on that. Carney commented that contrapositive is useful for about 50% of the LSAT, logic games and logical reasonings. Yeah, exactly. So especially in logic games, you're going to see it being primarily useful there in many, many cases. I've talked about it in the context of grouping games, but even in a lot of ordering games, it could be useful too. There are some ordering games that involve conditional statements. So I'd recommend considering applying it there also. Again, when the situation warrants it, when you have conditionals. All right, so that was the fallacy of the converse, the flaw of the converse, reversing without negating. Again, no good. Now, we've also got the other fallacy, negating without reversing. So that is when you change the truth value without reversing the variables around the arrows. And so that's also important to keep in mind. If you just say, given pizza requires happy, not pizza requires not happy, again, you didn't do the other part of reversing around the arrow. That's also important to do. And once again, that's saying that if I don't have pizza, I won't be happy. Again, failing to consider that tacos or burritos could make me happy as well. They're assuming that the necessary condition of happiness is sufficient to guarantee a particular result. So same logic, just a different framing once again. If you only do one part, you end up confusing necessary and sufficient conditions. No good. And again, just to illustrate here, they're failing to consider alternative possibilities, other things that could have made me happy. Again, they're both failing to consider they're both reversing necessary and sufficient, no good, and they are logically equivalent to each other. And interestingly, they're the contrapositives of each other too. That's not essential to know, but it is technically true and important to just keep in mind. It could be useful to think about things in that way, maybe.
Okay, could you just show the slide that you had just showed previously?
Yeah, sure. This one?
Yes. Okay, so that one. Okay. So not pizza, not happy. Okay, I got it. So that you're basically negating the sufficient assumption, which is a no-no. I mean, it's a sufficient statement, which is a no-no.
Well, you're negating both variables. So you see here, I have pizza requires happy, then I have inverse or the negation, not pizza requires not happy. So we're negating both of those variables, which is a good step to take, but it's not the only thing that you need to do here.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. By the way, get the PDF download. I've got all these slides there too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right, so now we've got the complex contrapositives. So complex is basically, we just have more variables going on. So it's relatively simpler, at least when there's only two, one variable for sufficient, one variable for necessary. But then we also have situations where we have multiple variables, which of course levels up the complexity significantly. But still, again, it's the same process regardless. So again, just to recap, that's the contrapositive process, reverse, negate, you get your clean result. Harry asked me a question on conditionality and causality. I'll cover that at a later point. We're sticking here strictly with conditionality, but that is an important distinction. I'll talk about it at a later date. I'll add a class to the calendar where we touch on that. So again, the process, reverse, negate, but here we've got an example with two variables in the necessary condition. What do we do? Especially because we have the word and here. There's some confusion I get a lot about and versus or. What do? We reverse negate like always, but when you're negating, and becomes or. Also, or becomes and. So the reason is that if we have two things required by X, in particular, in this case, two things are required to be out. If we had at least one of those in, that would be enough to tell us that X had not occurred. Anybody want to type for me in the chat what that result would look like if you were diagramming it? Perfect, Harry's got it. So Y or Z requires not X. Carney's got it also. Yeah, Whitney's got it, Ethan's got it, awesome. And yes, Alyssa, so if there are two variables and you negate them, and it becomes or. Exactly. And that's important to keep in mind. There are logic games conditional rules involving this very concept. They could give you an original rule involving and, they could also give you an original rule involving or, and you've got to flip it and change that as well. Harry's talking about the famous CDs game. Yes, if anybody wants to practice this on an actual game, Test 31 Game 2, the famous game featured in Legally Blonde as an exemplar of just how crazy and difficult logic games can be, or at least how crazy they can sound. Look up that game. Somebody have a question? I heard somebody unmute themselves, maybe.
Steve, yes, I had a question. Now for the logic games,
Yeah.
if we were to diagram Y or Z, to not X and we have to go backwards, it will say X, if X means Y and Z, correct?
So in this original here, X requires not Y and not Z. So X in means that both of those things must have been out.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sure. So this rule, I haven't even shown the contrapositive, but just in this original rule here, if this means that if you have X in, then Y and Z must both be out.
Okay. All right. So because sometimes when I'm doing grouping games, I'm not sure if I should if I go backwards, like what happens if X is not in?
That's a great question. Yeah. So what happens if X was out? Anybody have thoughts on that? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself.
Say that one more time, Steve.
Yeah, sure. So if we were given, if somebody asked us what happens when X is out, given this original rule, and this original rule is all we know.
Nothing happens. Oh, so go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Would either one be in? Would if X were out, would Y or Z be in, or both of them could be in? But it could be like either one.
Great question. Okay, so if X is out, here's the thing: we don't know anything about Y and Z. We cannot infer a single thing about the position of Y or Z. And I heard somebody else in the background say that as well. Yeah, so you know nothing. You don't know anything, and that's tricky to think because you see all these variables and you think if we know about one, we should know about the others, but the directionality of the arrow means everything. Y or Z, and as Nazreen said, Y and Z could be in, but not necessarily. Exactly. So their positions are not dictated. They could be in, could be out. We don't know.
I'm sorry. So it's when Y or Z are in or Y and Z are in. So
Great question. Yeah, we'll get to the contrapositive.
Is this sufficient enough to just have Y in to say that X is not in? Wait, I'm getting confused.
Yes, correct. And we'll get to the contrapositive formulation of this. So the question was, if X is out, what happens? We know nothing. X in requires Y and Z to be out. Contrapositive, reverse, negate, as well as changing and to or, which is part of the negation process. That says if Y or Z is in, then X must be out. I'll type this here, and then I'll also display it on the next slide. And yes, Alyssa's is also commenting or is inclusive. Exactly. So or includes the possibility of both. That is simply a formal logic idea. Or in, or means if one is in, maybe the other one's in also. You could have both. So if Y is in, X is out. If Z is in, X is also out. If you have both in, X is out, period. So the steps, the process, we reverse around the arrows. So first we put not Y, not Z at the beginning. Then we change and to or, negate everything. So not Y becomes Y, and becomes or, not Z becomes Z, X becomes not X. So if you have Y or Z in, then X must be out. So if Y is in, X is out. If Z is in, X is out. If both of them are in, X is still out. But when we're reading conditional chains, when we're reading conditional statements, period, you gotta follow the arrows in the direction in which they're pointing. So original rule, we can talk about what happens when X is in, we can make inferences. If we're told X is out, we cannot infer anything. Looking at the contrapositive chain, we can make inferences regarding what happens when Y is in, as well as when Z is in, as well as when both of them are in, but we cannot infer anything about what happens when X is out. And we also cannot infer anything about what happens if we're told Y is out or if Z is out, or if both of them are out. That wouldn't carry forward anywhere because there's no arrows stemming from those variables going forward. You can only follow the arrows in the direction in which they're pointing. Ethan, I saw you had a question regarding the grouping splitting game. If you have a question on a particular rule, just type it in the chat. But as for a full game explanation, I'll save that for another day. So just let me know what the question is, and I'll see if I feel like it makes sense for us to handle now. So here's what it might look like. So if X is in, Y and Z are both out. That's how I might diagram it if I were drawing a picture. X in, Y and Z are both out. So X requires not Y, X requires not Z. Contrapositive, Y alone is sufficient to require X out, and Z alone is also sufficient to require X out. And having both of them in would also allow you to say X is out. So the funny thing is that you actually, in this rule, you don't need to draw anything about the or and the and specifically. It's already implicit. So this is nice. It's actually really clean and smooth. When you have the word and in the necessary condition, things are simple. Also, when you have the word or in the sufficient condition, things are also simple. It gets much more complex when things are the other way around. If you have and in the sufficient, it's complicated. If you have or in the necessary, it's also complicated. But this right here is very smooth. So that's why I started with this kind of example. Now, Ethan was asking about a conditional rule. If Y is not selected, L is selected, meaning not Y, arrow L. So I'd simply say, not Y, arrow L. I would draw a Y with a slash through it, arrow pointing to positive L. And I'll type this in the chat, just writing it out a little bit. Not Y, then positive L. Contrapositive, anybody want to type that? Or just say it?
Not L means Y.
Perfect. That's it. So Alyssa's got it. Thank you, Alyssa. Ayana's got it. Ethan's got it. Yeah, you got it. That's it. So that's how I would deal with it. And then, of course, you could potentially combine it with other rules to generate inferences and such, but that's the rule pretty straightforward. Like, was there a follow-up related to that or something else about it?
Yes. When I was doing the game, it ended up being that both Y and L could be selected at the same time. And I wasn't understanding why or how that worked.
Oh, yeah. I'll get to that. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll go more a little bit later tonight into what exactly that means. We will cover that concept today. It's an important one. I'm glad you raised it. So this is the original rule again, and it's contrapositive. This is a clean type of rule, simple to diagram. And the funny thing is that you could actually break it apart into two separate rules, diagrammed separately if you wanted to. You could simply say X arrow, not Y. Also, separate line, X arrow, not Z. Then contrapositive, Y requires not X. Separately, Z requires not X. You could do that. You're not obligated to combine them, but it's nice to, and it's probably beneficial to do so because then you're linking rules together. You're seeing more cleanly X requires all of this stuff, and each of these variables alone require the same thing. So that is nice to know. I'd recommend combining them if you feel comfortable doing so. You'll end up with a cleaner, smoother diagram if you can avoid repeating variables on the same diagram, although it's okay if you write them separately. Again, it's simpler if you don't. So again, here's a different one now. I said this was the trickier. When you have and in the sufficient, it gets a bit more complicated to diagram and a bit more complicated to lay out. This is saying that if you have both X and Y, then you will lack Z. So the rule is activated when you've got both of them. Having X alone wouldn't tell you about Z, and having Y alone also wouldn't tell you about not Z. It's when you have both that this rule comes into play, when the arrow is activated and we can infer not Z. Anybody have thoughts on what the contrapositive of this would be?
Z requires not X or Y for this sentence.
Perfect. So Z requires not X or not Y. So Harry typed it. Z requires not X and not Y. I see Winnie also got it. Perfect. Yeah, so Z requires not X or not Y. Weird. Doesn't really flow off the tongue very smoothly. Hard to really think about it conceptually, but that's what it is. So you have those two things together. It guarantees not Z. Meaning if you had Z, then you must have lacked at least one of the two. Maybe you lack both because or is inclusive, but in requires that you lack at least one of the two. And you think about it, there are plenty of things out there where if you have each one alone might not be enough to guarantee something, but two of them together would be sufficient to guarantee it. Like maybe there are 3 potential meals you could eat a day, and having 2 of them means you don't need the third one. So maybe you skip breakfast, you have both lunch and dinner. So lunch and dinner together are sufficient to mean you don't eat breakfast. Meaning if you had breakfast, then you must have lacked at least one of lunch or dinner. So here it is. Again, I'm laying it out. We're reversing the variables around the arrow. So not z was at the end. Now it's at the beginning. X and y were at the beginning. Now they're at the end. Negating now. Not z becomes positive z. X becomes negative x. Y becomes negative y. And of course, and becomes or. Important to do that step as well in order to maintain equivalent meaning. Any questions regarding this rule? I know it's a bit more complex, and I'll show you the diagrams in a moment. All right, so here are the diagrams. So you see, again, it's weird, like I said, it's a little bit more complex. I want to indicate that having both x and y together in is what is sufficient to activate the rule, sufficient to guarantee the not z. So I do this plus sign. I also do a kind of a bracket. Then the arrow pointing to not z. That's what it looks like, at least in my style, when you have the word and in the sufficient condition. It's my personal diagramming preference. It's how I would go about it. You can feel free to make your own way regarding it, but it's not easy to make a clean illustration of this like we had with the previous example. Now, when we have contrapositive, and then I'll address your question. In the contrapositive version, I do a dotted arrow to indicate or in the necessary condition. If I put solid arrows, it would be indicating or suggesting that z requires both not x and not y, when in reality, I simply want to reflect that z in requires at least one of them out, not necessarily to have both of them out. So dotted arrows for or in the necessary condition, and as well as the bracket to indicate and in the sufficient condition. Could you do just a bracket, this little series of 2 lines here connected, and not use the plus sign? Maybe you could, but that might be confusing and tough to remember that it's actually an and there. Could you do just a plus sign? Yeah, maybe you could. But for me, I find it useful to really use both of those just to anchor it for myself that there's something big going on here. It's the 2 of those together are what form the sufficient condition. Then Ayana, it looks like I might have addressed your question already, but I'll just make sure I'm comprehensive on it. Would using this contrapositive help you solve a must be true? I mean, it could help you solve anything in the game. I wouldn't say it's in particular for must be trues. It's really just about conditionals and conditional rules and chains in general. They're useful for the entire game. So it could be useful for it could be true, could be useful for must be true, could be useful for it cannot be true. It could be useful for anything within the game. But it is important to illustrate this in some way. Now, I want to talk about linking or connecting conditionals. I talked about, we've done the contrapositive. The next step to really solving these kinds of games, and even logical reasoning in certain cases, like I said, is linking rules together to form inferences. A contrapositive is a kind of inference, by the way, but if we're looking to really make a lot of inferences, conditional chains are the way to go. So, like I said before, you want to have the same variable in multiple rules. In particular, it's nice when you have a particular variable as a necessary condition in one rule, and then as the sufficient condition in another rule. So I talked earlier about A requiring B requiring C. That's probably the easiest example I can think of. A little bit more complex would be if you have a negative variable as well, because again, negative variables, not as clean and nice as positive variables. It's easier for us typically to think of things in positive terms rather than in negative terms. So here we have not y in the necessary of the first rule and in the sufficient of the second rule. So through, I think, what is called in formal logic the transitive property, and that's a formal logic term you don't need to know, you can link these together. X requires not Y, requires Z, which is what I would put on my diagram. It's what I would write out the entire thing. I wouldn't simply say X requires Z because that's leaving out the not Y information. And there could be certain cases where that not Y information is actually useful. In particular, if we were in a situation with longer chains where they were asking about not Y in some way, I would want to retain that. I would want to keep that and still have it on my scratch paper to potentially use at some later point. Obviously, in this example in isolation, what we're really driving at here is that X requires Z. That's useful to know. And if you really want to next level it, you could take the contrapositive of this entire 3-variable chain and say, what? Feel free to type in the chat, what's the contrapositive of this entire thing? Just as a little exercise.
Not Z to Y, not X.
Perfect. Awesome. You got it, Winnie. That's great. Harry's also got it. Not Z requires Y, requires not X. That's the contrapositive of this entire thing. So maybe they would ask you, if X is in, what must be true? Z. If Z is out, what must be true? Not X. That's the kind of inferences they're looking for you to make. And of course, with more rules added on, it gets even more complicated. Having the entire chain in front of you is really useful to solve these questions like they're nothing. Yeah, so as Alyssa's saying, exactly, you find the common variable and you use that as a way to link them together. Got a question regarding deductions. What do we know? Yeah, I mean, what you know is exactly this. You know that when X is in, other things follow if you follow the arrows in the direction in which they're pointing. So here, if X is in, we can say both about what happens when with Y and with Z. In particular, Y is out, Z is in. Those are the deductions. Knowing that X requires not Y isn't that impressive because they told us to us directly in the first rule, but knowing that X requires Z is a bit more impressive because it required linking these together. So X requires Z is an inference, and they're going to reward you for that. There could be a question on that. And of course, when you have more variables and more rules in play, more conditional statements, you're going to have to link those together and then follow things from the beginning to end, like a domino effect, knowing that A requires B requires C, all the way to A requires Z. Beginning to end, you follow it from the beginning to the end. They're going to reward you big time for that because most people aren't going to have these kinds of conditional chains. And so we're making the chains now, then we'll practice reading them, and reading and interpreting them is really what it's all about. So like I said, you might want to do both where you take the contrapositive and you link things together. So it's like you're combining multiple skill sets in one place, big rewards for that. So let's say we were given C requires B as one rule, and we were also given A requires not B. It's nice, we have B in both, but one's positive, one's negative. So in order to clean it up, in order to be able to actually link these together, you want to take the contrapositive. And you could take it of either one here, but I'd suggest in this particular case, taking the contrapositive of the second one. You could do either one, but the reason I'm doing the contrapositive of the second one is because the second one already has a negative variable here, whereas the first one doesn't. So if we took the contrapositive of rule number 1, C requires B, we would end up with 2 negative variables. And I don't like negative variables because they're tougher to read. We think better in positive terms than negative terms. So in this case, I'm going to choose to take the contrapositive of the second rule. So I'll end up with more positive variables. As you see, the result here has 2 positive variables rather than only 1. So A requires not B, contrapositive. B requires not A. So now we've got B over here and B over here. So we can form a longer chain. C requires B, requires not A. Our inference being C requires not A is the biggest takeaway here. So if they ask you if C is in, what must be true? They're going to be looking for not A. You could have done it the other way, and that would be correct, and maybe it'd be useful also. But we could also at this point just list out the other one. So what's the contrapositive of this particular chain when things are combined? I see Solomon's got the inference here, which is awesome. So Solomon's got if A, then not C. That's perfect. I would want you to write out the entire thing. A requires not B, requires not C. I still want you to keep the not B there, just in case it were useful later. But the key inference, as Solomon says, is exactly A requires not C. So well done. That's it. That's what you want. That's what they're going to be looking for. So as we were saying earlier, if we've got, where was I going to go with this? Okay, so we've got two independent variables, each requiring a result. You can link them here too. So if you have or in the sufficient condition, things are simple. It's a clean result. And you can combine, you could list them separately. Like I said, X requires Z, Y requires Z, or you can combine them to say each of X and Y is sufficient to require Z. So each one alone is sufficient to require Z. So in logical terms, I would simply say X or Y leads to Z. X or Y requires Z. So the common variable Z is what lets us link them together smoothly, and I would probably recommend doing so. Now also, again, a nice clean diagram, because we have and in the necessary, A requires both B and C. You could list them separately. A requires B and A requires C, but I think it's better to link them together. If we've got the same sufficient condition, we can link them smoothly. This is asking if there's a contrapositive with this. Yes, there is. There is always a contrapositive for any conditional statement, as the other Alyssa is saying. Well done, so that's right. The thing is that that's not the point I'm looking to make with this particular example. I'm looking to simply show you how we can link things together and what it would look like. As Harry put in the chat here, let's see what's Harry saying. Not B or not C requires not A. That's perfect. So if we have A requires positive B and C, we reverse and we negate. So the B's and C's become negative since they were positive in the original, and becomes or, and then of course A becomes not A. So the contrapositive of this big rule is not B or not C. Each of those alone is sufficient to require not A. And because or is inclusive, having both of those be negative was also fine. Now, we've got a drill for you. Try connecting these rules. First, P requires Q. Secondly, not Q requires not X. Third, Z requires not Q. And then not Z requires not A or not B. So what would it look like to link those together? I'll give you a moment. So you'll see it's somewhat arbitrary here. I happen to lay it out one way. Of course, I'll also show you the contrapositive, but this is connecting everything together. Part of what makes this complicated is that we've got some and or stuff going on here. So as I said, that's the less nice thing to have to deal with, because the or in the necessary requires those dotted arrows. And then you're translating and or, it's a bit much. It's not the simplest example, but we've covered some simpler ones already, so I thought it was time. So I'm gonna read it out now. So basically what this diagram says is that if you have P or X, then you will have Q. If you have Q, then you don't have Z. If you don't have Z, then you must lack at least one of A or B. I'll say it again slightly differently. Each of P and X, each of them alone, is sufficient to require Q, meaning P requires Q, also X requires Q. If you have Q, then you don't have Z, and if you don't have Z, then you will also lack at least one of A or B, meaning you will not have at least one of A or B. A lot of folks typed that formulation in the chat, which is correct. the contrapositive would be equally correct. It would just look very different. Any questions on this layout and this formulation? And then I'll go on to the other one.
I just have a quick question about reading this, what we've just created right here. Can we read this diagonally to infer that P means not B and vice versa, and X means not A?
Yeah, you can. That follows fine. I mean, the fact that what's on top and what's on bottom doesn't matter. So
Okay.
P leads to either not A or not B, and potentially both. Doesn't matter if one's on top, one's on bottom.
Sweet.
And yes, you can follow from the beginning to the end either way. Just left to right, the arrows in the way in which they're pointing. And someone asked me to type it out. I'm just going to copy paste one of the responses here because it's perfectly fine. And the slash before variable means it's negative. So if P or X is in, then Q is also in. If Q is in, then Z is out. If Z is out, then at least one of A or B is out. When you write things out, you're typing them, you could do a slash before the variable to indicate a negative, or you could simply write out the word not. Either one's fine, but this formulation is correct. I got a question regarding where are the ands and the ors. So I'd say there's an or here, P or X, then Q, that's an or. And then we also have not Z requires not A or not B. So in this layout, we don't have any ands. We only have ors. But since we have ors in this formulation, we will have and in the contrapositive. We'll actually have, since we have two ors in the original, as I'm laying it out, we will have two ands in the contrapositive. I got a question from Harry about the sort of LSAT games question, which pair of variables cannot both be included? So mutually exclusive variables. Great question, comes up a lot. In this particular game, or this particular conditional chain, which rule expresses that kind of relationship? So in this diagram here, can somebody tell me what's a pair of variables that could not both be in or positive? Anybody want to share? So we got a couple of responses here. We got P and B. We got Q and Z. We have X and Z. Nice. All right, so I would say Q and Z is good. Q in requires Z out. So if you have one, you cannot have the other. So that pair of variables, you couldn't have both. Also, X and Z, you couldn't have both. X in requires Z out, requires having this conditional chain, but that's good. But P and B, the problem is that we've got a dotted arrow here. So if P is in, then Q is in, then Z is out, then at least one of A or B is also out. But we don't know which one. So it's possible to have P in as well as having B in, but maybe we would lack A. In fact, if B was in, we would lack A in that particular instance, since we know that at least one of those two has to be out. So dotted arrows are a bit more nuanced than solid arrows are, which is why I express them this way to make it more clear. But yeah, interpreting these chains is a whole separate thing. It's a lot of work to get used to this sort of diagramming language. Any other questions here, or should I go on to the other formulation, the other layout, the contrapositive of this? All right, so here's the alternative diagram for those of you who did it the other way. If we have both A and B in, then we will have Z. If we have Z, we won't have Q. If we don't have Q, then we will lack both P and X, or meaning both P and X will be out. So you see I'm breaking out the plus and the bracket here to say the two of those together being in, A and B together, form the sufficient condition. Together, those variables tell us that Z is in. If Z is in, Q is out. If Q is out, then both P and X are out as well. And I'm going to put in the chat, I'm just going to copy paste the student response that shows us what the result looks like in the contrapositive. A and B are in, Z is in, Q is out. If Q is out, then both P and Q are out. So there it is for you typed. So same meaning, just looks completely different. But this is another way to lay it out. And I would recommend in a logic game doing both of these. Having both of these would be useful and I would recommend it. Any questions on what this diagram layout looks like? Or how to interpret it? It's the same logic, just looks different. One common source of confusion in a diagram like this would be, if A is in, what do we know? And if A is in, we know nothing. Being told A is in alone doesn't allow us to make any inferences at all, because the rule is about what happens when you have both of them in. But A alone tells you nothing, B alone tells you nothing, but being told both A and B are in together tells you Z is in, Q is out, P and X are both out. All right, so I'll go on to the next. Basically, it's about reading the chains. You only follow the arrows in the direction in which they're pointing from beginning to end. So you start with X, X in tells you Y is out, Z is in. C is in tells you B is in, and A is out. B in tells you A is out, but B in does not tell you about the position of C. Think of the arrows like a one-way street. You only go in a certain direction. B is in, A is out, but B in, C could be in or out. We don't know. Same on the top chain. If Y is out, Z is in, but Y being out doesn't tell you where X is. X could be in, could be out. We don't know. And it might look easy here, but when you have much longer chains, people start to go backwards on them, which you do not want to do. Again, the games play on that common student misconception. So again, just laying out what the meanings are here. Follow them in the direction in which they're pointing, and that's that. Now, once again, we have both of them side by side, following them along. If P was in, Q is in, Z is out, at least one of A or B is also out, and maybe both, because or is inclusive. But we have to note the or, because one of those alone being out would be enough to satisfy the rule. So you could have P in, A out, and B in. You could have X in and B in along with A being out. That would all be fine. Contrapositive chain, if you have both A and B in, then Z is in, Q is out, both P and X are also out. But Z in doesn't tell you where A and B are. On the other diagram, Q in doesn't tell you where P and X are. So if we were told if Q is in, what must be true? We could say Z is out. And we could say at least one of A or B must also be out. But we wouldn't know anything about where P and X were in that particular circumstance. So the thing is that if you're starting at the beginning, you know a lot more than if you're starting at the middle. And if you're starting at the end, well, you can't really infer anything. But a lot of games will ask you about the middle specifically. They'll ask you about the beginning also, but asking about the beginning is easier because there's less ambiguity there. You just follow things along. But when they're asking about the middle, that's where people tend to look backwards. These two diagrams are not the only two possibilities for the entire game. Because if you're told if Q, you would know about Z being out, you would know at least one of A or B was also out, but you wouldn't know where P and X were. So P and X will kind of be on the fence. In that case where Q is in, P An X could be in, they could be out, one in, one out maybe. Lots of ambiguity, lots of possibilities. So while these two diagrams happen to serve as examples of valid scenarios, if you simply listed who was in and who was out, there are still many more open-ended possibilities there. So again, just interpreting what these diagrams are looking like, what they mean, if you're starting at the beginning. Now we get to the fun stuff with regard to interpreting the conditionals. So at least one out is the simpler kind of rule. Obviously, A requires B is pretty much as simple as it gets. Negatives are where it gets a little bit more complicated, so I'm just starting there. This relates to Harry's question about variables that could not both be in. If X is in, Y is out. If Y is in, X is out. This means at least one of the two must always be out. They conflict. They are mutually exclusive. So at least one's out. Maybe both will be out. You cannot have both in. I guess as human beings, we're prone to conflict because this is like the easier thing to get. People consistently get this one fine, but the other one is where they have trouble. But I'll start here. So here's how you might lay it out. 3 possibilities. We're using a T-chart. If X is in, Y is out. If Y is in, X is out. And maybe both are out. What I have not depicted is what happens, what I have not depicted is X and Y both being in, because that's impossible. Yeah, so some people will do a biconditional arrow with a slash through it. That's great. That's another nice way to do it. I don't typically do it that way, but you can. It's perfectly fine to do that. So this is the at least one out. 3 possibilities. I wouldn't list them all on the same diagram, but these are different ways they could play out in theory. And so for particular local questions, you might do any of those 3 depending on the circumstance. So you might have a scenario where X was in and you'd be able to say Y was out. Or you might have a scenario where Y was in and you could say X was out. And then you might end up with a particular local hypothetical where both Y and X were out. But the X and Y in together is impossible. Now, here's an example. Original, if you eat cookies, then you won't eat donuts because they're both desserts. They're bad for you. You shouldn't have too many. Contrapositive, if you eat donuts, you cannot eat cookies. So at least one of them cannot be eaten. At least one cannot be in. And maybe you'll lack both. A parent's not going to force their kids to eat desserts, most likely. So you could lack both, but they will not permit the kid to have both of them together because it's too much sugar and it's almost bedtime. I'll go back to that for one more second in case anybody's writing it down, but again, you have the slides. Now, 3 possibilities specifically with this: C in, D out, D in, C out, maybe both of them are out. So this is exactly the same as the XY slide from before, just with this particular example. Now, the other one, at least one in, is where it gets a lot more complicated. And this is a consistent source of student confusion, so definitely listen up for this one. This relates to the question Ethan was asking from the grouping splitting game with Y and L. But I'll keep it to X and Y example here. If X is out, Y is in. If Y is out, X is in. That means at least one of the two must always be in. And maybe both of them will be in. But you cannot lack both. And this is really confusing because we see them side by side on the conditional statement. One's positive, one's negative. And we're prone to thinking about conflict, so we see, one's positive, one's negative. It could be that one's positive, one's negative, but not necessarily, because we got to look at the starting point. If you lack one, you have the other. It's establishing a minimum for what needs to be in at least. If you lack one, you have the other. But if we were told y is in, what would be true? What could we infer if y is in?
If y is in, we can't infer anything.
Exactly. So kind of a trick question, but you got it. Exactly. If y is in, we don't know where x is in. X is. X could be in, could be out. We couldn't possibly say. We can only make inferences about what happens when y is out or when x is out. So starting with a negative. So if they say, if x is out, we can make an inference. If they say, if y is out, we can make an inference. But if they told us a positive like y is in or x is in, we cannot infer anything. So it is entirely possible to have both. It's entirely possible to have both of them in. Really tough to absorb. I've made tons of mistakes on this back when I was studying. I even had the old notes at some point where I caught myself making this mistake. It's entirely possible to have both of them in at the same time. This simply establishes a minimum saying you've got to have at least one of the two in. So here's what those possibilities could look like diagrammed. Maybe you have y out, activating the rule that you have x in. Or maybe you have x out, activating the rule that you have y in. And maybe you have both of them in. But you see, what's missing here is having both x and y out, because that is impossible given this conditional rule. And so in a conditional statement, I see a question in the chat related to this from Alana. If you have a conditional statement saying, if x out, then y in, you cannot start with the variable on the right side of the arrow, in this case, y in, to infer anything at all, because there's no continuation from that point. You can only follow the arrows in the direction in which they're pointing. So x out requires y in. If you were told y in, you don't know anything else at all about the position of x. X could be in, could be out in that particular circumstance. So you wouldn't be able to make an inference on that basis. Now here's an example. If you don't eat your peas, you must eat your carrots. Contrapositive, if you don't eat your carrots, you must eat your peas, because they're both vegetables, they're good for you, so you gotta have at least one of the two. Establishing a minimum, you cannot go without vegetables, and those are the only two options. You're gonna have at least one of those two in. So you have at least one, maybe you'll have both, but you cannot lack both of those two vegetables because they're good for you. So laid out with the example in the T-chart, if P is out, C is in. If C is out, P is in. And maybe you have both P and C in. But you see, once again, what's missing is having P and C out. That is impossible, cannot happen. That's what's missing here. So you see, notably, both P and C are in the in column. Nothing is stopping it. I know it sounds crazy, but that's exactly the nature of this kind of rule. If we go back, and I'll just go back for a moment to the conditional, it said, if not P, then positive C. If not C, then positive P. So given looking at positive C, there's nowhere to go forward on that. Therefore, nothing is stopping you from having P in if we're given the information that C was in. So C in, nothing to infer. For that reason, nothing is stopping us from having P in. Similarly, if we're told P is in, where's carrots? Who knows? Could be in, could be out. Anything's possible. Carrots could be in, carrots could be out. We cannot say. So these three possibilities are all true. P and C could be in together, but we could not have them both in the out column. Any questions on this one? This is really what it all comes down to. Very important to get this concept down. This has come up in so many logic games. I have a whole list of them. In particular, aside from that CDs game, and I'll repeat this again in a moment, Angelica or Virginia, but we've got the CD's game, Test 31 Game 2, the most complex example of in-out conditional grouping games. You've also got Test 33 Game 2, Birds in the Forest. You've got Test 45 Game 3, the Photographs game. You've got Test 58 Game 2 with volunteers. And I have a list of these I'll send you. I'll put this in the chat before we wrap up. But in particular, look at those games. They involve lots of conditionality, conditional chains, and this concept of at least one in. Now, to repeat what I was getting at here, P and C could both be in together because nothing is stopping you from having both. Given the conditional rule, again, that conditional was not P requires C. That tells you about what happens when P is out. It doesn't tell you about what happens when P is in. So P in leads to nothing. Carrots in leads to nothing. So being told carrots is in doesn't tell you about the position of P's. P's could be in, P's could be out. We don't know. It's open-ended. So for that reason, nothing is stopping us from having both P and C in. All right, so just putting them side by side. The at least one out is when we start with a positive and end with a negative. So the position of the variables around the arrow with regard to positivity and negativity determines everything. If we start with positive and end with negative, that is the conflict. That is at least one out, and that is the easier concept to get. When we end on a negative, we are forcing something out. So look at the necessary condition. That tells you what must result. If we end on a negative, we're losing something. If we're losing something, that means we could not have both because something was forced out. So think of it as like we're ending on a low note. We're ending on a negative. That sucks. We're losing something. Alternatively, if we end on a positive note, well, that's upbeat. We're getting more stuff. We're establishing a minimum such that at least one of the two must be in. We're gaining things. In this case, it's vegetables, which maybe isn't the most exciting, but that's the nature of the rule. The first one, X arrow, not Y, at least one out, is like the cookies and donuts. If you have cookies, you can't have donuts. You have donuts, you can't have cookies. Both desserts, they're bad for you, shouldn't have too many. So at least one is being lost, at least one is not getting eaten. Other example, peas and carrots. If you don't eat peas, must eat carrots. Contrapositive, not carrots, then peas. We're gaining something. We're ending on a positive. At least one of those two must be in. But again, nothing is stopping us from having both because when you have one, we don't know where the other one will be. Could be in. So again, just another way to illustrate it. At least one out means you can't have both, at least one out. Again, nothing stopping you from lacking both, but typically people tend to get that. It's the nothing stops you from having both on the other rule that really is the most common source of confusion. So really think about that at least one in idea. That's really what this is all about, where the confusion typically comes from. Now, I promised you I would get you a list of these games. I have one that I will put in the chat. The first category there lists the particular games I would want you to practice. I have one game of my own that I wrote. It's in the course. It's about legislators voting on bills. So take a look at that one inside the course. I've got a video on it as well. And then I've got several games that illustrate these concepts really well also. In particular, again, the Birds in the Forest game, the Fruit Stand game also, Test 36 Game 1 is another good one. That Fruit Stand game in particular is a great one if you want to practice and study those games with the confusing and or rules, where you have and in the sufficient or in the necessary, a bit more complex, a bit more unwieldy to diagram. That Fruit Stand game in Test 36 is a great place to practice that idea. And then, of course, the CDs game that Harry referenced, the Legally Blonde game, Test 31 Game 2. I didn't put it on that list just because it's so much more difficult, but it is another good one to work on after you've mastered the others. Questions? Well, if not, I appreciate you all sticking it out. I know we went a bit long tonight, but I thought it was important we got through everything. And in the future, we'll go through some actual games and walking through diagramming them and such. In particular, I get a lot of questions on that legislator one, so I'm happy to cover that. But I'm glad you all enjoyed. Thank you all for being so engaged and asking such great questions and participating. You all really are getting this, and I'm excited to see that. So please keep in touch and let me know if you need anything at all. We got class tomorrow night, and so please join for that. Any requests, any suggestions, I'm listening. So thank you all. Have a good night. I'll talk soon.